As the war in Iran has dragged on, it's become increasingly clear that while it might not be their ideal outcome, the U.S. and Israel are not totally opposed to the idea of a civil war in Iran. The CIA has reportedly been arming Kurdish separatist groups in the country. Israel's defense minister said that any new regime leader would be, quote, an unequivocal target for elimination. And in a recent Truth Social post, Trump threatened to make it virtually impossible for Iran to ever be built back as a nation. So, in this video, we thought we'd try our best to figure out what a civil war in Iran would actually look like and explain why it would probably be catastrophic for the wider region. She was ranked second in our list of the world's most influential people. So, in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, we discuss how he got so high on the list and how China's hard power is. So before we get into it, we should say that in making this video, we're not saying that we think a civil war in Iran is inevitable or even likely, at least in the short term. Contrary to what Trump apparently expected, the regime's grip on power doesn't seem to be slipping. And if anything, the war seems to have consolidated their position by causing something of a rally around the flag effect. Furthermore, while there were reports last week that the U.S. and Israel were trying to convince Kurdish militias in Iran to rise up against the regime, it looks like the Kurds, who are probably the most organized and well-armed separatist group in the region and would have presented a real problem for the regime, essentially said no. This was presumably in part because Trump effectively sold them out in his first term when he suddenly withdrew U.S. support for the Kurds in Syria, but also because while the Israelis are apparently still keen on it, American enthusiasm for the idea apparently waned late last week once Turkey, which has long been worried about Kurdish separatism, signaled that a Kurdish separatist effort in Iran could invite Turkish intervention. Anyway, the point we're trying to make is that with the regime tightening its grip on power and the Kurds refusing to get involved, a civil war looks unlikely in the short term. However, in the medium to long term, it's very much a live possibility. If the war continues with further decapitation strikes and perhaps even strikes on Iran's critical infrastructure, as Trump threatened in a recent Truth Social post, then it's not hard to imagine things falling apart. Even if the regime survives the war, it'll still be unpopular. And the new Ayatollah, Ali Kham's son, Mojtaba, who is both more hardline and even less popular than his father, might struggle to keep the country together. So if a civil war does happen, what would it look like? Well, the key thing to understand is that an Iranian civil war would be chaos for at least the Middle East and probably the entire world. Syria is a useful benchmark here. The Syrian civil war was incredibly destabilizing. The conflict lasted over a decade and claimed something like 650,000 lives, roughly half of which were civilians. The subsequent power vacuum paved the way for the rise of ISIS, a threat that still hasn't really gone away. And more than 6 million people were forced to flee the country, mostly to Turkey and the EU, triggering an unprecedented migration crisis that upended European politics. In many ways, the Syrian civil war still isn't over. While Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shar, has done a lot to unify the country, his new government still doesn't have total control over parts of the south and northeast. It'll take billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment to rebuild Syria back to its pre-war state. So you get the point. The Syrian civil war was incredibly destabilizing. But when that civil war kicked off in 2011, Syria had a population of just 22 million people. An equivalent civil war in Iran would be many times worse, given that Iran today has a population of about 92 million people. If the Syrian civil war is anything to go by, this would imply something like 25 million refugees. This would be an order of magnitude worse than Syria. Accommodating 6 million refugees was difficult but possible. Accommodating 25 million, however, which for context is roughly the same as the entire population of Australia, would probably be functionally impossible, especially given that a lot of them would presumably flee to countries on Iran's eastern border like Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, none of which have the state capacity to properly deal with millions of refugees at the moment. Moreover, the Syrian civil war was so destabilizing internally because, somewhat unsurprisingly given Syria's position in between Iraq and a Hezbollah-dominated Lebanon, there were quite a lot of weapons lying about. This problem would be infinitely worse in Iran. Not only are there lots of guns in Iran, there are also lots of scarier weapons like cheap missiles, drones, and even apparently some 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium. Given the nuclear risks, if Iran were to descend into civil war, this would almost definitely force an international intervention of some kind, which would risk turning Iran into a quagmire, many times worse than Afghanistan. An Iranian civil war could also wreak havoc on global energy markets. For context, Iran currently accounts for something like 5% of global oil production and about 6% of global gas production. A civil war would probably production, meaning less global supply and thus higher prices. Moreover, a civil war in Iran could also create piracy-related risks to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which, as we've seen in the past couple of days, would mean market-kedly higher global prices, given that something like 20% of all oil passes through the strait. In the longer term, there would also be the risk of political fragmentation. Now, we should say here that we don't agree with the idea, apparently quite popular amongst armchair geostrategists, that simply because Iran is ethnically diverse, political fragmentation is therefore somehow natural or inevitable. It's true that Iran is a remarkably diverse country. Ethnic Persians constitute a slight majority, but Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Balochs, Turkmen, and Arabs all represent sizable minorities. But it's also true that most Iranians have a sense of national identity that transcends ethnic divides, and it's therefore wrong to straightforwardly equate the collapse of the Iranian state to liberation or self-determination for its non-Persian minorities. Nonetheless, separatist sentiment does seem to have grown in recent years, as evidenced by the fact that, unlike in the 2000s, most anti-regime protests in the past decade have originated in minority regions on Iran's periphery. And if the regime were to collapse, it's not hard to imagine parts of the country trying to break away. The most likely contenders would probably be the Kurds in the West, who've always wanted their own state and could combine with other Kurdish groups in the region. The Azerbaijanis in the north, who might seek support from Azerbaijan proper, and the Baloch in the south, who, like the Kurds, have always wanted their own state, and could combine with existing Balochistan separatist groups in the region, including perhaps most notably the Baloch Liberation Army, which currently operates out of Afghanistan and has staged a number of terror attacks in and around the Pakistani province of Balochistan. This would destabilize not just Iran, but a number of its unfortunate neighbors. If you found our video helpful in keeping an eye on the global scenario, please like and subscribe our channel.